Vladimir Zelensky will have to make a deal to end the war in Ukraine and make concessions. United States President Donald Trump made this statement today after saying yesterday that it's important to determine whether Ukraine or Russia started the war. United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio called it an exaggeration to say Putin became bolder and increased attacks on Ukraine after meeting Trump in Alaska. And Putin's larger-scale attacks are simply the normal development of the war, which Trump wants to stop but doesn't know how. As a result, Marco Rubio announced a personal meeting between Trump and Zelensky next week. Everything appears fine: diplomacy, leaders' dialogue, and a chance to align positions. In reality, this is a moment of truth, because over the past few weeks, Trump has made a lot of contradictory statements. I'll end the war in a month, Russia is the aggressor, I'll tighten sanctions when Europe stops buying oil and hits China. There might be a summit, another one, or none at all. Putin and Zelensky will never sit down at the negotiating table because they hate each other and so on. Kyiv, Warsaw, and Vilnius are not waiting for a photo of Trump and Zelensky, but for specifics. Whether there will be an air shield over the western part of Ukraine. Will there be secondary United States sanctions on Russia's Shadow fleet? Will there be an acceleration of F-16 and long-range missile deliveries? And will there be a real link between sanctions and supplies? That's why in this episode we'll break down what's actually on the table before the meeting between Trump and Zelensky, and what agenda the American president will now be pushing. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is September 16th. And before we start this episode, I want to remind you that every day on this YouTube channel, several news and analytical segments are released. So that you stay up to date with absolutely everything, I recommend subscribing to this YouTube channel if you haven't done so yet. Today, September 16, the White House confirmed a possible Trump-Zelensky meeting as soon as next week. And Trump himself is already warming up the agenda. First of all, Trump publicly stated today that Zelensky will have to make concessions and sign an agreement to end the war. It would seem that nothing terrible was said here. We've all heard this before, if not for one thing. The day before, Trump made it clear that he would not impose sanctions and promise tariffs against Russia's allies until Europe does so, and until Europe gives up Russian energy resources. A window of opportunity has opened because Slovakia and Hungary can simply be pressured to give up Russian gas and oil. They're big Trump supporters, so why not? That's why Trump decided to make this demand even more impossible to fulfill. And he added that when all NATO countries, not just Europe, but all countries of the North Atlantic Alliance, give up Russian gas and oil, when all NATO countries impose tariffs against China, then he will fulfill his tough promises. And the White House took this step deliberately because NATO includes Turkey, which most likely will not fulfill any of these demands. Against this backdrop, the threat from Republican Senator Lindsey Graham looks simply ridiculous. Senator Graham threatened Hungary and Slovakia with consequences for buying Russian oil. Here is his quote. "When it comes to buying Russian oil right now, almost everything depends on Hungary and Slovakia. I hope and expect that they will soon commit to helping us stop this bloodshed. If not, then there must be consequences, and there will be." But let me remind you, this is the same Lindsey Graham who threatened 500% tariffs against China, India, Turkey, and anyone who buys Russian oil. He made those threats just a few months ago. In the end, it led to nothing. So, what do Trump and Zelensky have on the table? What cards do they hold? As the American president puts it, Kiev has a clear list. Close Ukraine's western airspace with NATO forces and expedite F-16 and long-range ammunition deliveries. To impose secondary sanctions against the insurance of Russia's Shadow fleet, transshipment ports, and Asian banks through which Russian barter is conducted. Oil for iron. Close loopholes for electronics, bearings, and chemicals without which the Russian Federation's war machine stalls. And stop publicly looking for doors to peace when Moscow, after Alaska, only intensified its attacks on Washington. A set that can be read from open remarks. Trump, for the first time, called Russia an aggressor out loud, admitted that ending the war is not as easy as it seemed, and immediately put the issue of sanctions on hold until Europe stops buying oil and imposes tariffs on China. At the same time, his advisors, in particular United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, say that a month would be enough to end the war if the parties enter the doors of peace that Donald Trump has opened. And they add that the key issues are territory and guarantees. Well, I just want to say that we've already heard all this before more than once. When are you going to move on to action? Warsaw, hearing all this against the backdrop of the Russian drone attack, responded to Trump in the toughest way possible. This is not a mistake, this is an attack. We need protection, not some conditional formulas. Brussels. He discusses why a tariff war with China is impossible and the real path forward. These are targeted secondary sanctions on companies aiding Russia. This is the set of issues that Trump and Zelensky will meet with. Now let's take a closer look at each point. Zelensky will clearly meet Trump to discuss protecting Ukrainian airspace. Well, not because it sounds nice, but because it prevents a repeat of the night when 19 drones were hovering over Poland and all of Europe was watching live as Russia brazenly attacked a NATO country. Zelensky has the first moral argument. This will protect both us and you. The technical argument is that there is an expert assessment that 120 aircraft are enough to protect the entire belt along the Ukrainian border. And third, the political argument, otherwise tomorrow drones won't come to Warsaw empty, but already with warheads. Plus the sanctions matrix. You don't need to wait for a mythical collective sanctions package from the European Union, the United States, all NATO countries, and all allies at once. You can strike more narrowly, but still painfully. Insurance, ports, banks, and so on. Trump is actually in a tough spot here. On one hand, he needs to show strength. After the drone attacks on Poland and tough questions from NATO's eastern flank, the phrase, "we're thinking about how to respond," doesn't cut it anymore. On the other hand, Trump has publicly tied the toughness of his sanctions to unrealistic conditions. If after meeting with Zelensky he comes out to the journalists saying, "Well, we discuss peace," it will only strengthen the feeling of Groundhog Day where Moscow is stalling for time again and everything repeats all over. If he comes out with specifics, for example, giving the green light to an air defense dome over Ukraine, launching secondary sanctions, speeding up the delivery of F-16s and long-range missiles, and so on. Now that would be a real turning point. There's another subtle detail. In the United States, people like the image of decisive action far from Europe. For example, Trump's statement that ships belonging to Venezuelan drug cartels were destroyed. This works for domestic approval ratings, but it doesn't go well with sending a letter to Europe about tariffs against China. Let me explain. And Poland is asking a very simple question. So you, the White House, are ready, to take out boats and suppose drug cartels in the Caribbean, but are you ready to take out the insurance of the shadow fleet of the Russian Federation? Banks bartering with Moscow are prepared to impose secondary sanctions on anyone aiding Moscow. If the answer comes only after Europe, well, the impression of the meeting will be, to put it mildly, weak. It turns out that Trump is ready to attack where the risks are lower, but where there are any risks at all, he says, let Europe do it first, and then maybe I will. Conclusion. This meeting between Trump and Zelensky isn't about pleasantries. It's about making a choice. Either Washington takes a short but real step toward putting pressure on Moscow, secondary sanctions, plus an air shield at least over western Ukraine, plus speeding up arms deliveries. And then his words about a quick end to the war finally start to make some sense. Or everything once again gets bogged down in formalities. When Europe, then US, when China someday, and then Kiev, Warsaw, Vilnius, and Brussels will have to defend themselves on their own. Without the American umbrella, but with American quotes in the archives. And then Trump will completely lose any respect, not only from allies, but also from opponents. I'll put an ellipsis here. Share your opinion and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like.